I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practice's research agenda and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Amy Fong, Vice President, leads the practice's strategic outsourcing and vendor management membership, as well as custom projects to support procurement and supplier management. Jimit Arora, Partner, leads Everest Group's research offerings focused on enterprise executives in IT, sourcing, and vendor management, and along with shared services. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Michael. Take it away, Michael.
All right, good morning. Thank you. And as we get into the outline of the presentation here, discussion points, what we're going to do is we're going to cover this in a couple sections here. First, Amy and I will talk about some context for the next normal. Then we've got the meat of the presentation really in the publications. Those are the things that we're going to use to set the stage for the main points. And then we'll have a couple case studies here that will try to bring this to life and illustrate it in the context of specific business processes. And then we'll have some Q&A. And obviously, you can ask questions along the way, and we'd be happy to gather those up. And if we have time, we'll incorporate them into the presentation, or we'll wait to the very end. So with that, Amy, why don't you go ahead and let's get us started on the next slide here. Let's talk about some of the setup for what we're seeing.
Sure, thanks, Michael. Thanks everyone for joining us today. So what we're seeing is really a series of different external forces that are driving all of our services buyers to reevaluate the aspects of their service delivery, both internal and what they're purchasing from the market. And you'll notice there's nothing even on this slide that says COVID-19, although these are all obviously directly related to the economy, the economic changes and the recession that we're facing right now, as well as COVID-19 induced changes to service delivery. And the first one is cost structure pressures. So almost every organization that we work with is looking at some type of cost reduction imperatives, 71% looking at operational costs and 62% at external spend. There's obviously a lot of overlap there. There's also a lot of concern over whether we have the right partners, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. Significant number of people saying they're looking at either changing their partner portfolio, implementing new technologies and automation. There's an increasing urge there, as well as looking at their sites and their locations and maybe even exiting countries, but at the same time developing some kind of cross-location resilience. And then finally, on the right here, service providers, some of the major tier 1 service providers in the industry are coming out and saying they're going to increase their work from home over the long term. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But essentially, we see potential for service providers to have a 50 to 75% shift in towards work from home in the future. And that's a pretty big impact when you think about how you contract, how you manage your data security, and all of that. So we're at this point in outsourcing where really all options are on the table. And we're trying to meet and balance different goals, right? We need to dramatically reduce costs. We need to lower our risk exposure. We need to increase productivity. And quite frankly, in a normal time, these goals would be a bit at odds. So there's a balance, right? We know historically in procurement, if you want to lower your risk exposure, you may want to add additional suppliers. But if you want to lower your costs and reduce costs, you may want to decrease your suppliers. So this is become a great balancing act between first more outsourcing and less outsourcing. So do we move things back in-house? Do we put more of it out to service providers because that offers us a better cost structure?
Another way to think about this is portfolio consolidation versus portfolio expansion. So that could really be two dimensions there. It could really be the number of suppliers that you're using. So you could be looking to de-risk it with more or less. And then you could also be looking at scope changes. So you could be looking at, hey, do I want to increase the scope of what that I'm using in an outsourcing or insourcing conversation, or do I want to decrease the scope? So those are both possibilities.
Yeah, we also think about, do we want to move more onshore and repatriate some of our processes, or do we want to move more offshore? In many ways, this is a cost trade-off, but when we start to look at some of the ways things rolled out in the immediate, the early days of COVID, and when we look at minimizing our risk in the future and a lot of nationalistic pressures, there's also a bit of a pressure to bring things back onshore from a risk perspective. We'll talk more about where we think the market is going to go in this area.
And then finally, you've got the view of how you have your internal services provided. And so there could be sometimes referred to as captive or GBSs. You could be looking at expanding what they're doing. Or, for example, in some organizations, they look at the GBS as being a cost center, and they're looking at saying, hey, how can I go to the marketplace and partner with external service providers and monetize that potentially and get maybe an overall net benefit from scaling it and using a third party to do that, and also maybe some cash up front for that can be used for future investments.
So these are all big decisions. We have tried to focus the discussions around this when we talk with the buyers of services, the companies that are outsourcing. We've tried to focus around these 6 areas: sourcing strategy and provider portfolio, solution design, cost and pricing, performance management, governance, policy and contracting, and risk management. These 6 buckets kind of tend to keep coming up. It's a good way to organize our thinking. We will refer back to this later, but right now I want to turn it over to Jimit to start talking through the provocations that we're going to go through.
Thank you, Michael and Amy. And the webinar was titled 6 Key Considerations, and as Michael mentioned up front, this is where we're going to have the discussion around the way forward and what you need to do to future-proof your outsourcing estates. So what are provocations, right? The way we like to think of them is that these are somewhat contrarian ideas that challenge conventional wisdom. And Amy and Michael have given me the mandate of setting the stage for each of these provocations, probably because I feel so strongly about them. So with that, let's go to the first one. This one actually gets me very emotional, and I was warned by our marketing team that it is not appropriate to call your audience stupid. But this isn't about the audience, because the folks who show up on our webinars are the smart ones. So, however, and again, not to be flippant, but there's so many conversations that we've been a part of where the entire discourse is all about rates and rates alone. And we cannot say this enough. I know a number of you were on our previous webinar on pricing. Optimizing rate cards contributes just a small, tiny percentage of the value leakage in outsourcing. We call it the P times Q conversation, where P is the price and Q is the quantity. You bring these together to create the spend. And as a sourcing exec, let's get over this fixation on rates, focus on them, but also provide disproportionate focus on the Q and look beyond these immediate saving levers to create structural wins. Let's unpack that a bit more.
Thanks, Jimit. Great lead in. And the audience will notice that Jimit likes to have a little fun with the provocations and get a little edgy, which I think leads to some good discussion on these. So when we look at the opportunities that buyers have in terms of cost savings and meeting that first goal of reducing cost structure, we really break it out into 2 different areas or 2 different directions. One is the direct negotiated cost levers on the left here. And there's certainly a need to keep your eye on these. So making sure that your rate cards are competitive, making sure your COLA impact waivers and things like that, your skill premiums are what they should be. That's kind of the first layer of that. But anyone who works in sourcing or procurement or supplier management knows that you need to look at the bigger, more sustainable cost savings as well. And if you just squeeze those things on the left, they're going to come out somewhere else in the process. So if we look at some of the win-win cost impact levers, this is really the more indirect savings areas on the right that we think people need to be balancing. So thinking about your offshore leverage, thinking about automation. We're not going to talk as much today about automation, but there's certainly an opportunity and a trend towards using automation to increase productivity as well as reduce costs overall. And Jimit referenced a webinar we have. There is a link in the footer here to a webinar we just did about a month ago on outsourcing pricing. If you want to dig deeper into this pricing concept and where some of the opportunities are, I welcome you to go back and watch that or contact us, because there's a lot of great tactics in there from our pricing assurance team. We also see, when we break these out in terms of immediate and structural changes, we did poll our audience a couple weeks ago, or months ago actually, and saw that service providers really are using an assortment of these tactics. So if you look at the left, these savings levers that are more immediate, like scope recalibration or rate card reductions, and on the right are structural changes, automation, process design, moving work in-house or offshoring more, looking at all of these longer term options. Looking at the numbers here, everybody's doing more than one, right? This was obviously a question where you could select more than one, and most of the respondents did. There's really a combination of efforts. That's what makes this a very complex time for most of the buyers, and that's why we're here to talk about all of these various questions we need to ask ourselves going forward. And with that, I'll turn it back to Jimit for the next.
Absolutely. Yeah, so thanks, Amy. And I think it's a great recap of why we think it's not just about the rates. And it's good to see the progress that we're seeing both on the immediate and the structural ones. So let's move to the second provocation. And this is a bit of a fun one, right? There's an analogy that is often used, I'd say misused, that outsourcing is like a marriage. Sure, if you can renegotiate terms every 3 to 5 years and indulge in polygamy. Sorry, sticking to the theme though, and it's important to have a bit of fun. I think one of the things that enterprises need to really think through very carefully, given some of the comments earlier about all of the changes and pressures, is do you or do you not stick to your incumbents? And if you do, are you staying under the same terms of the contract? Or, going back to the analogy, are you re-signing your prenup? And here's our POV on this, right? You may or may not choose to stay with your incumbents. However, the way you contract and manage them needs to absolutely change. So that's our provocation, and let's unpack that. So, why would I say that things need to change? And let's examine some real startling realities, right? So every year, as part of our peak matrix evaluations, we do between 400 to 500 client reference check interviews. And when I say reference checks, these are companies that the providers have submitted saying, hey, here are our best clients, go speak to them. They will likely say nice things about us. Guess what? 51% of 299 clients on the IT side that we spoke to, reference clients, came back and said that they were dissatisfied with their providers. And dissatisfied means a score of 7 or below, which is you are not a promoter for the supplier. And given that these are reference clients, I shudder to think what the average clients might say. By the way, this number of 51% dissatisfaction has just been going up over the last 3 years. So what are some of the things that they dislike? You'll see a few items on in blue on the lower left part of your screen, which is the client centricity, flexibility, domain expertise, project management, the more transactional ability to manage the relationship they like. But the elements that create value, those are the ones that are missing. Number one issue, innovation. Number two, poor communication, inability to manage talent appropriately, and how do you really bring in that collaborative and consultative approach. So that's a structural need in this industry, that there's rampant dissatisfaction with the outsourced landscape. So what do you do as you go forward, right? So if you look at the landscape of suppliers and how that's changed, there's a lot of impetus here to think through how you need to reconfigure your supply portfolios. Let's take IT application services in banking as an example. And again, I say this is banking, though I would say that the thesis kind of plays out more broadly. Given that banking is one of the largest sectors, we chose this as being representative of the marketplace. So we started publishing our peak matrix reports, more than a decade ago, and the visual on the left, the fairly poor colors, and you can comment about our visual arts choices from a decade later. But the suppliers circled in red are either no longer present in the landscape, or they've seen a significant change control event. So the happy middle, as I call it, more than half of the major contenders and aspirants or emerging players no longer exist. And this just happened after the global financial crisis. Now, the leaders segment, that has strengthened, and as a client, you have more options. So here is my prediction, right? As we look forward over the next 3 to 5 years, expect more consolidation. But this time, it's not only going to be in the mid-tier segment, but also extending to the leader segment. So foundationally, what we are seeing is there's rampant dissatisfaction in the portfolios. There's a lot of change that's already happened and will happen. And you layer in COVID, and we have a situation where clients are looking to rationalize the tail, strengthen the core, and essentially answering 3 questions. Who do you retain? Who do you drop? And who do you add in, right? So that's the question that we see people wrestling with. So how do you act now to future-proof this portfolio and unlock value? We believe that you do that by moving away from the legacy approach, right? Let's move to the next slide. You move away from the legacy approach that segments suppliers by scale, right? And I know a number of you have seen this before. What we used to do in the past is we used to have our largest partners, largest service providers, be designated as strategic partners or tier ones. The smaller ones got called tier twos or staffing companies, right? And that was a very simplistic approach to segmenting the portfolio. What we think needs to happen, and in full disclosure, I think we've been seeing some of this happen even pre-COVID. Now we're just seeing an acceleration of that. We need to be thinking very intentionally about the role that different companies are going to play. Yes, staffing stays, and you'll have a lot of services that will be consumed through staffing and gig companies, so that mode will stay. But instead of just thinking of our companies as tier ones, a lot of services that are traditional run the operation services can be aggregated into simplified managed services contracts and given to what we call is the legacy aggregator, right? So that's that second mode, big managed services, non-differentiated services, bundle them together, bid them out, lowest cost provider, high predictability, high scale. So different model there. The third mode is the orchestration, and we are seeing a sprawl of providers. If you think of RPA, there's 30-odd RPA platforms potentially in your ecosystem. You think of the startup ecosystem, the fintech, health tech, insurtech. As procurement, as the business, it becomes really hard for us to manage them. So you bring back the service integration concept and have the orchestrators manage these, right? So that's a new mode that we see companies use. The fourth is you designate some companies as your transformation partners. And this is where, one of my peeves is, hey, we don't get innovation. If you don't pay for innovation, don't expect to get it. And don't expect to get innovation from your legacy aggregators who you are incenting on just keeping the lights on. Let them keep the lights on, keep innovation expectations in abeyance, and focus all of the innovation and transformation with a set of partners who you designate for that, pay the necessary premiums, and make sure you get the business results. And then finally, you will need a set of specialists who bring in unique skill sets, unique talent that you might need. So as you think about that post-COVID world, this is a great opportunity to press reset, think about how you're going to segment the portfolio into these categories and how you contract and manage them becomes different. So yes, whether or not you renew your vows with incumbents, it doesn't matter, but definitely change the way you contract and manage them. With that.
So great, Jamit, and that innovation issue has been something I've seen in the industry over the last 3 decades. It's something it actually was a #1 issue back in the 80s and 90s, and it's still there as we speak today. So
absolutely
see that continue on. So Peter, let's go to a quick poll here. If you could bring that up here, and what we're going to do is get some of your input from you, So we're going to open it up, give you a minute or so to have your input. So the question is, what changes are you considering making to your service provider portfolio? Are you planning to consolidate? Are you planning to add providers with specialty capabilities? Are you dropping lower performing providers or shifting geographies, or there's none of the above or something else? So let's see, the results are coming in. It's a horse race, guys. There's a little bit of a favorite in one of them, but it's a horse race. Coming around the final turn there. We'll give it another minute or another few seconds. I'm sorry, another few seconds. And it literally is going to be down to the wire here. Oh, we've had a change in leadership here. All right, so Peter, let's bring up the answers here. And literally, you're going to see here a little bit of separation at the very end here. So adding providers with specialty capabilities, that seems to be the #1, but it is so close to almost the exact opposite, which is to consolidate providers. Those are the #1 and 2 issues there. Jamid, I don't know if you had any instincts there that what you were expecting to see.
No, I think this is actually very encouraging, right? So the consolidation goes back to the thesis that we said, hey, you want to rationalize the tail, strengthen the core, and that's effectively what we are seeing play out. I think what's the thing to be cautious of is let's not go crazy when we're thinking about adding the specialty providers, and truly examine whether or not what they categorize as specialty is not just another flavor of commodity. But no, I think intuitively this makes a lot of sense with what we are seeing in the landscape. Okay, with that, let's move to the third provocation, and this is a bit of an extreme position, and I recognize it doesn't apply in all situations, but we have this unique environment where a number of clients are recognizing that we're sitting at almost 100% remote delivery. Things that we thought could never happen outside of our offices, outside of secure environments, can be done remotely. So I think that's been an epiphany of sorts for the landscape, for the executives. If you couple that with some of the visa restrictive talent policies that are coming in, companies are re-examining their onshore offshore ratios, and in certain flavors of IT, we've seen that 80% offshore was the norm, and now with 20% offshore, we think what's going to happen is we are going towards more of a 95% potentially offshore, as high as 95% offshore and 5% onshore. Now, this is an extreme anchor, and we get it. And in a variety of situations, you won't be able to reach those targets. But there's a number of progressive companies who we are seeing who are looking at this opportunity to build the business case for additional offshoring, and challenging their own teams, their own executives to ask, hey, why cannot we do this in a manner which unlocks savings, which can then again be reinvested back in the business where it belongs. And then, beyond cost, right, there's a lot of structural levels which also suggest that there's going to be an increased move towards offshore in the long term for some of these IT-oriented portfolios. With that, let's keep moving, and I wanted to take us to the fourth provocation, which is closely related to the onshore offshore mix. And there's been this whole philosophy of, hey, there's so much work from home. Will we ever go back to the offices? And maybe we don't need these ODCs or offshore development centers, offshore delivery centers in the future. Here's our take on this. The stories of the death of the ODCs are highly exaggerated, and it's not going to be that we are not going to go back to offices anymore. Slightly contrarian view. By the way, I also want to bet today. I had been challenged that I couldn't put in kittens and rainbows in a professional webinar, but I just did. And yes, because work from home is real, but that journey is not going to be one that's easy. And what we wanted to do was to unpack that and reinforce the belief that the office, the ODC will have a role to play. It will look very different, but it's not going to go away.
Thanks, Jimit. So let's talk a little bit more about work from home. We did a recent study. Some of you may have seen the survey out in the market on work from home and what that might look like, and how real this really is. And so when we asked people what their portion of their outsourced workforce will be work from home in the future, you kind of look at this gray to blue shading. We asked about current, and we asked about where you think you'll be post-COVID-19. No timing on that. We can all, guess about whether that's 3 months, 6 months, or 2 years in the future. But you see a bit of a shift back to the office. Now, I think it's worth noting that for most outsourcing, we'll talk about some exceptions when we get to, work from home agents later. But for most, it was pretty close to zero. You'd have almost a gray bar here in the past. We at Everest Group, we've kind of broken out work from home into 5 different levels, going from full-time in the office to full-time from home. And then you see a lot of kind of hybrid situations in between. We do see a shift, and we do expect a shift of some people back into the office. And I think that supports Jimit's controversial statement that the ODC is not gone. But there's certainly still a lot of blue on this second bar where, we're going to still see almost half of these roles in many cases, and depending on the provider, it may be more, still in a work from home mode. Why is that? We asked service providers specifically why they would move to work from home and what their most prevailing reasons were. Improving access to talent, surprisingly, was one of them. I probably would have guessed that cost savings would have been the most common answer here. Achieving societal and environmental benefits, that's come up a lot, as has improving delivery outcomes and productivity. And then there's some other responses here in terms of strengthening the relationship and the risk aspect. I did see someone in the chat ask about cost savings, and from our estimates, we think that it's approximately 15 to 25% over 3 years that could be saved with work from home. Now there's huge variation, and that's a forecast, but that's just a general direction here. We also, it's worth noting, I think on the right here, that for the majority of companies, work from home increase is not expected to significantly impact outsourcing decisions. Not a surprise. Once we make that decision to outsource, it's fairly set in, and this is not the it's not the lever that we move back and forth very significantly. So let's take a look at how we decide which aspects of our services can be outsourced. And this, I think, is a big question for a lot of us, because if we're looking at 50%, I'm sorry, not outsourced, but work from home, we're looking at around 50% of these positions being work from home, whether they're internal and we're making these decisions with our GBS, or whether they're external and we're allowing our outsourced providers to deliver them in a work from home model. We need to think about what is the most conducive, right? So there's really 2 aspects, or two barometers we look at. One is the feasibility, the ease of remote delivery. So how much collaboration is needed? What are the tech infrastructure needs? How much is the process standardized? And you kind of see a range there of feasibility. And then also important is the acceptance of risk associated with remote delivery. So is information and data security a priority in this area? Delivery and location risks that we may need to, specifically control for, as well as specific risks related to home and source locations. In certain countries, we may feel more comfortable with a home office situation than we do in others for various cultural reasons or technological reasons or other things like that. So, we could spend a lot more time on this. We have various versions of this slide where we attempt to assign, to put certain processes into each of these 4 zones. And if that's something that you'd like to have a conversation about, we're certainly happy to have that conversation. It may not be the same answer for every organization, and for every industry, it's certainly not the same answer. I want to go back to the data a little bit, because what we've heard from our clients and our SOVM members is that there's a lot of concerns when moving to manage a work from home situation. And, a lot of people talk about productivity. Interestingly, data security, not surprising, but important, is that data security and compliance really come out on top. which is exactly what we had been hearing before we got the data to back this up. So people are really looking at, a number of things. How do we strengthen policies? How do we do additional training on home security practices? Go and help people actually understand how to maintain their safety. That's an issue both onshore and offshore. And then also technology to help with this, right? So there's encryption protocols, authentication protocols. There's a variety of different technology solutions to this. We also hear about employee burnout. That is a big concern of quite a few organizations, and it's one that, when we talk about talent, comes up quite a bit, as well as the difficulty in team collaboration. People were actually more concerned that their talent would burn out or would not have the same collaboration levels than they were about productivity and output. So things like virtual training and helping managers to learn to manage in this different way. I've talked individually with quite a few leaders, C-level executives, who are really working on how do we change our culture in a way that doesn't disincentivize people who are in a work from home model. And then finally, on the productivity side, the interesting thing that comes up on this is trusting employees is always first, and some of the technologies around productivity that are out there are not as heavily utilized yet. That's not to say that won't change. And I think when we see trusting employees, what we most often see is that in combination with some other factors. So it's not just that we trust employees and we don't do anything else, but it's a combination of all of these things. And we'll continue to see this evolve. One thing that we're not going to dive too deeply into today is that when this change is happening in your third parties and your service providers, there may be contract terms that you need to change as well. So we made a lot of bending, temporary exceptions to our MSAs when we went into the work from home model in a bit of a rush back in March. But how do we look back at those terms and make them more permanent and find ways to, balance the risk and the data security responsibilities and all of that?
Yeah, Amy, I think that's good data there. And as we've been asking these questions of our clients over the past few months here, we've definitely seen a stabilization of the top concerns. They were significantly different than the concerns of the first few weeks of the crisis, which was more about, just doing it in a work from home environment, the technology, getting laptops, things like that. But these data security compliance, those things have stabilized on the number one issues, top issues. All right, so let's do this. We're going to give you an opportunity to ask for a conversation with either myself or Amy or Jamit here over the next few weeks here. And so what we're going to do is we have a question specifically saying, would you like us to talk more one-to-one? And so they're really focused in on the 6 aspects here that Amy was referring to, or Jamit was referring to earlier. And we wanted just to ask you the question. We've got a checklist of 25 things that we think are important. Is that something that you're interested in? So this is just click the button here if you're interested. Let us know. We'll be in contact with you. And it's not really a quick poll per se, but the technology is the same. So go ahead and do this. And this is specifically geared for enterprises. So if you're interested in a future conversation, we just give you the opportunity to express that right now. So we'll leave this here for another 5 seconds, and then we'll move on. All right, fantastic. Let's go on, and I think Jamit, it's going over to you.
Perfect. Yeah. So provocation 5, and this is one where the pendulum keeps swinging. We were in a time and materials mode for a fair bit, pivoted to other more managed models, and now I think, given all of the changes, we believe that this is perhaps the beginning of the end of T&M. Again, it's an extreme statement. We get it, but we wanted to challenge your thinking. So what's effectively happening here is that the desire for more accountability in a model where oversight becomes less possible is raising the tide for managed models. So let's look at that in some details, right? So again, most of you have been doing this forever, and will recognize that there's 5 modes of outsourcing. I saw some questions about, hey, a lot of what you guys are speaking about seems to be IT application centric. So we wanted to take a theme across the provocations And then the two additional categories we look at will have an example of a BPO segment in the contact center space and an infrastructure segment to prove that, hey, this is happening not just in one category, but across the board. So with that context, as you think about the applications world, especially for agile development, we have 5 broad modes we are seeing. So you have time and materials, or some sort of capped T&M. You have managed capacity models, right? Then you have target price models, fixed bid, fixed fee models, and then output-based managed services models. Yes, the very rare situation you'll see business outcomes linked contracts, but these are the 5 major ones. And for the most part, we had seen 1 and 2 to dominate. But what we expect to see increasingly is a shift away from the traditional 1 and 2 models to more of the fixed bid output-based models. So how do we see that playing up, and what would it take for us to get to this state? We believe that there's 5 major prerequisites to move to a managed service model, right? It's not intended to be entirely exhaustive, but these are the main building blocks. You need standardized, homogeneous output inputs, output units, which are discrete and measurable and consistent across the organization. So think about story points. You have a consistent definition of what a story point is within your organization. So that becomes important. You need predictable volume variations, right? And let's think of that for a second. Variations are fine. Let's make sure they're not behaving like the Tesla stock. So you need some predictability within limits, because that allows you to get to a managed service outcome. You need repeatable high volume transactions, right? So you cannot just do this in something where it's low volume, high inconsistency. You need a lot of good historical baseline, right? Part of why these output-based models haven't really worked out is that it wasn't that baseline information did not exist. So most companies started with T&M and just stayed there. So that historical baseline is important. And the 5th one, and this is where I think it gets harder, but that's been the accelerator due to COVID. There's a willingness on the part of the client to cede some control. So as you think about the next normal, get ready to cede some control and get more comfortable with models that create accountability and transfer of ownership.
All right, thanks, Jamit. And so we're gonna have one more final quick poll here. This is to get more of your input here. We'll get to see how it works out. So what percentage of your outsourcing contracts are based on time and materials? So we just have 4 bands there. It's less than 25, 26 to 50, 51 to 75, and 76 to 100, or not sure. So if you don't know the answer, it's not applicable in your case, that's okay. And we'll give it another 10 seconds here. Okay, this is not so much the horse race. There's really 2 bands of the data now, just really one winner here. Okay, why don't we close it off there? And so what we're seeing there is a lot of them out there, Jamit. A lot of contracts out there based on time and material. So
that is fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, and I go back in history when many of the contracts we saw out there, you go back before the labor arbitrage conversations with India. Most of them were not time and materials. Most of them were output-based conversations on a per contract, per count, per claim, per travel ticket, things like that. So I wonder if we will get back to a timeline where it's not based on labor as we move away from labor arbitrage as the primary value proposition. So. Good to see.
Yep. No, I think that's good, and it was also interesting to see how many unsures were out there, which were roughly a third. Anyway, let's move to the final provocation before we kind of make this real in 2 additional instances. And use this crisis, and this one again, we've all joked about how the traditional SLAs don't work. So use this crisis to pivot away from the traditional SLAs and focus on the metrics that really matter and create true business impact. Right? So for over a decade, maybe 2 decades, the services industry has spoken of the watermelon effect. The SLAs are green, but the business outcome feels red. So green on the outside, red on the inside, the watermelon. So how do we use this change to pivot to true metrics that matter, that create business impact? And again, in the spirit of consistency, let's look through applications, and then we'll take it to BPO and infrastructure. Thinking about IT applications development, earlier we used to think of, hey, what's the productivity in terms of number of hours spent, the number of times you put code into production, lines of code developed. What really matters to the businesses has evolved. So it's about things related to productivity, quality, schedule adherence, the rate of fulfillment, and the rate of deployment. And here's where newer KPIs and metrics become important. And so if you don't have velocity rates, defect densities, story point accuracies, replacing some of the traditional waterfall measures, you aren't really measuring the right set of metrics that create value. And one thing that we've seen becomes really important, tying it back to the managed service conversation, it's very important to harmonize across the internal retained organization, right? So if the metrics in the retained organization define a story point a certain way, you can get to a good baseline as to what you would expect from your outsourced environment. Think of claims. How does your internal team process claims versus at what rate would you want your outsourcer to process claims? So again, if you're not focusing on some of these examples that we have on the lower half of this page and defining the bands in terms of what's lenient, typical, or stringent, the watermelon will not turn into a honeydew, which is green on the outside and green on the inside. So let's use this opportunity to change and pivot away from the metrics.
Yeah, and Jimit, this has been one of the age-old challenges out there. I think sometimes people, when they're setting up their SLAs, get a little confused between whether they're trying to create the diagnostics, so what, look at the underlying causes versus the outcome or the output they're wanting as a business. And that especially becomes true on the business side when you're doing like BPO. And it's really important to think about, hey, are these things we're going to use to help fix the problem, or is this the things that are going to be that we need to have in place to manage the business? And so I think, if you kind of put that lens in place, you change your filters on what metrics become important. All right, so let's move to the third section here. We're really going to talk about the tale of two categories. And this is really focusing in on a couple different case studies. And so, Amy, I believe you're going to take that one here.
Sure. So we have two examples in here, and they both are related to services that we all as consumers probably have experienced at some point: customer service, customer call centers, as well as workplace services, which tends to be your corporate help desk and the IT support that you get as an end user. So we're going to go through this rather quickly, and there's a lot of detail in these slides, so you can always refer back to it. But if we look at the customer experience management space, we've seen quite a few changes in the landscape of the providers over the last several years, and this has really evolved quite a bit. Looking at this from a work from home perspective, though, what we've seen is that the delivery model has also gone through high growth. And some of the data on the left hand of this side of this looks at work at home agents. We actually collected a little of these forecasts pre-COVID, and we saw this increasing significantly to about 20%. Pre-COVID. Now with COVID, we think this is going to increase even further. When I spoke earlier about, some outsourcing was work from home or work at home before, work at home agents were one of the shining examples, with penetration much stronger against certain industries like technology, retail, a little bit more in travel, hospitality, and telecom and media. And this is a great example where some of those SLAs that Jimit talked about really make a difference. So if we look at an SLA like first call resolution, what we're looking for in call centers is really a balance, and this should apply to pretty much all processes, that we're looking for a balance across different metrics that drive the right activities. I'm not going to go through the 4 different scenarios here, but I think if you look at the bottom row here, when you're looking at high and you're measuring and driving towards high first call resolution, low average handle time, and a high net promoter score, those 3 outcome oriented measurements all kind of drive the right behavior. And in our research, first call resolution improvement by 5% can reduce your ACV significantly, about $160K for a 250 FTE voice contact center in the Philippines. So those are pretty significant numbers. I'm going to hand it over to Jimit to talk about a workplace services example as well, to kind of bring some of these provocations to life and how they play out.
Yeah, and Amy, I think what you mentioned there was very interesting, right? So we spoke about the changes in the supply landscape and how that's evolved significantly. We
Mm-hmm.
spoke about the service configuration and how we think about what value looks like and how that's changing, how that's being enabled
Exactly.
through COVID. And we looked at how the metrics need to evolve to create true business impact. In a segment, by the way, like contact center, which has traditionally been called a commodity, boring, stable environment, right? So I think it's fascinating to see the changes that have happened. And in digital workplace, again, from a sourcing perspective, relegated to, yep, stable, yep, boring, and we say not so much. And this is the infrastructure example. And as you think about it, this is the one area that's really made companies either shine or not shine, given that everyone has a laptop and needed that laptop and needed to be productive. So the objective function from a CIO's perspective has shifted away from being, hey, let's design the workplace for the enterprise, to the workplace for the user. So the reasons for consuming these services have changed. As sourcing professionals, what we saw was that the fundamental pivot in designing it for the enterprise was to minimize unit cost, but now it's kind of shifting to how do we maximize employee experience and productivity. The mind shift is shifting from, hey, how do I resolve an issue very quickly, to one where we've anticipated them and can move to a thesis of potentially zero resolution. And we're not just thinking of outcomes that are considered in terms of IT metrics, but business metrics. It's not subjective and observational, but more around how do you really make this objective and data driven. So the way I like to think of this is that the raison d'etre for this function has actually truly transformed, and therefore the way we source, the way we price, the way we manage has to entirely change. The way we source, right? So if you look at the landscape of suppliers, you'll see the theme of how we've shown evolution over the last few years. We looked at it in apps, we looked at it in contact center. Now let's see what's happened in workplace. And I'd say that the situation in workplace has actually been the most significant. If you look at the leaders 5 years ago, this space was dominated by the hardware players, the IBMs, the Dells, the HPs, right? Fast forward to now, and the landscape is actually dominated by the service-centric players. And let me make an important clarification. This includes not just the service desk, but also the field services and the last mile support. So it's not a change in definition of the marketplace, but the players who really invested have changed. So you see the HCL, TCSs, Wipros come up top. Folks like DXC, the legacy HP acquisition, they've announced intents to back away from these services in some ways. So in a virtual everything world, might we be able to finally solve for the boots on the ground issue that has traditionally been a problem, and drive more remote resolution, leverage a lot of ship to fix models to transform this space, right? One of the biggest cost drivers was this whole thesis of the onshore dispatch. So how do we really save money there, invest in some remote support tools? And to do that, you would have to take a very critical re-examination of your provider portfolio, and then re-examine who you renew your vows with or who you don't, right? And then finally, the metrics that matter. We've been pioneering this whole thesis in the digital workplace space, and it kind of extends to other areas too, as to how we need to pivot away from the technical service level agreements to the business aligned experience level agreements, right? And as you see that, the objective function has to change again to comprehensively measure user experience in a manner that impacts productivity. So as you see on the bottom left, the metrics I spoke about in provocation 6 need to change. It is not just about operational metrics such as mean time to resolve MTTR or number of tickets or devices managed, which is essentially measuring how effective are you at measuring the mess, or how effective are you to eliminating the mess, right? So that's the thesis that needs to evolve, and therefore the way we think of metrics needs to change. What really successful companies are doing is constructing composite experience level agreements, XLAs, that combine operational metrics with some momentum metrics through device telemetry, right? User reported data, and combining it with business KPIs to create a composite XLA score, driving pricing on that composite XLA score, something that the traditional metrics could simply not do. And that, we believe, fundamentally underscores the point about what you measure matters, and let's go out and measure what truly matters if we want to transform the service experience. Michael?
Hey, Jimit, let me pick up there. I think we just want to wrap things up now, thinking about what are the summary of those next steps. When we talked about the provocations earlier, we went through 6 different provocations before we got into those areas. And I just want to kind of catch up on those. You know, we talked earlier about how many decisions there are to make, and I think each of these 6 areas has its own combination of factors to consider in your organization. So the first was thinking about where are the opportunities for structural savings? Where can we take out costs where it'll really stick and we're not driving our service providers to the point that they're unsustainable in this environment? Second is thinking about our service provider portfolio, and Jimit gave a great framework that we use on the IT side, but certainly can be carried over with a similar strategy across other process areas. Confirm your future offshore-onshore mix. I think the idea of going from 80-20 to 95-5 is probably pretty common for a lot, or pretty accurate for many organizations. If you're way down the spectrum at 10 or 10-90 right now, or totally different, different shift, 50-50, think about how that's going to change in the future and what your target is. Finally, or in addition, thinking about your work from home strategy and what you're willing to accept for service providers, and which of the processes that you outsource are most appropriate, and what are the rails, the guardrails you need to put in place there to manage your own compliance and your own security. There's been a number of breaches in the headlines, and we really need to be all very aware of the opportunistic threats that are coming in right now. We talked a little bit, Jim touched on a shift from T&M to more mature models, and that's an important thing to think about. How do we shift to those? Maybe not now, but maybe in the future. And then finally, this concept of updating SLAs. I love the concept of XLAs that Jimit spoke about, and the way that they really capture the value of the end user or the experience. I think we need to look at how those concepts from workplace services can be carried across other processes. So it's a lot of questions. We may have, from looking at some of the polls, raised more questions than answered them, and that's certainly the way we should all be thinking right now. We're challenging the status quo. We're challenging where we were 6 months ago, and looking at how we end up in a better combination, a better outsourced offshore model than we did in the past. And as we wrap this up, and we may have time in a minute for a question or two, I do want to just highlight for those who are not familiar with Everest Group, how we work with sourcing organizations, how we work with enterprises. We have a variety of different ways that we work with organizations. We have both ongoing retained support in the way of a strategic outsourcing and vendor management membership, as well as pricing as a service. A lot of the questions that we talked about today really are the things that we are helping our SOVM members solve right now, and it's a long-term partnership. We're with you on the journey to improve your model. For those who are looking for more targeted support, we also have accelerated project-based support, whether that be sourcing advisory services or strategic proposal reviews or other things like that. And I think all of these 6 areas, my count is off today, all of these 6 areas fit into these both programs and projects that we can support. So I'd encourage you to reach out to us and have a conversation if you're stuck on any of these challenges or the questions that we've brought up today.
All right, so as we close out the webinar here, there will be an opportunity to say yes to the 25 question checklist that we were talking about earlier. When you close out the webinar itself, there'll be a little pop-up screen there that you can check yes on that. I'm not sure we're going to have time for questions and answers today. So I think we did get a number of questions here. We'll try to answer those as we go forward, and try to give you an individual response as that makes sense. And as always, we want to also let you know we have lots of related content that are available on our website. So check out our COVID tracker. We specifically geared it toward the services industry, so we're checking that out. And we've got tons and tons of content on the work from home. Amy was referencing, you saw some material today, where a work from home study that we're just completing, and she showed you a few of the data slides from that as we previewed those today. And there'll be a lot more on that conversation, the risk, and also a lot of the things we do on pricing, and a lot of things we do on service providers. So certainly check those out on our website, on our content. And with that, I think we're ready to close it out here right on time. So we appreciate your time today, and thank you for attending.
Thank you to Michael, Amy, and Jimmet, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, you will receive a follow-up email within 1 to 2 business days with a link to download the presentation slides, along with accessing the on-demand playback of today's live session. On behalf of Everest Group and our presenters, thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.